Good evening, and thanks for joining us. I'm Steve Kornacki. Rachel has the night off. A bill has reached the president's desk. There is no need to adjust your television. I know it's almost impossible to believe, but the United States Congress tonight has actually done something.
On this vote, the yeas are 64, the nays are 36. The motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to House H.J. Rec. Res. 59 is agreed to.
Earlier tonight, the United States Senate passed that mouthful of Senate jargon, otherwise known as a budget. As you heard there, the margin was pretty wide, 64 votes yes to 36 votes against it. It's the same budget bill, of course, that passed the House last week in a vote that was even more lopsided. The spread there was 332 to 94. And this makes it the first time since 2009 that a budget has actually been agreed to. Now, this is admittedly a pretty low bar. This is a small ball bill. It's not exactly monumental legislation we're talking about here. But even at that, the fact that there's any budget deal at all shows Congress is being functional in a way that it has not been in a long time. And part of this budget, at least the math behind this budget, was made possible by something else that happened this year, when the Bush tax cuts were allowed to expire for the wealthiest Americans. Maybe you remember the fiscal cliff deal that President Obama signed at the very beginning of the year. That deal brought in a ton of new tax revenue into the federal government by not only allowing those high-end Bush tax cuts to expire, but also by raising things like the capital gains tax. So President Obama started off this year with a deal to end most of the high-end Bush tax cuts, something he'd been trying to do for a long time, something he had campaigned on in the 2012 election. And now he is ending the year with a 2-year budget deal that will likely avert another government shutdown. So this is not the most momentous day in the history of the Republic. We're not going to be looking back at this day 50 years from now and saying, where were you on December 18th, 2013, when Congress passed that budget? But this is still a significant development. Those two deals that bookend the year, the one in January, the one today, they are important and they are consequential deals. And yet, this morning, as the Senate was preparing to approve this budget, the website Politico was busy asking this important question. Which president had the worst year 5? Was it Obama? That headline from Politico pretty much echoes perfectly what is now apparently the majority view of the Beltway media. Obama's worst year. That was the headline in the New Republic. Obama had the worst year in Washington, according to the Washington Post. This was the Daily Beast. Worst 5th year ever? Maybe. Beltway media has concluded that President Obama has had not just a bad year, he's not just had a terrible year, but he's had the worst year of his entire presidency and quite possibly the worst 5th year that a U.S. president has ever had. Okay, so maybe we can take a breath here for a second. I mean, yes, President Obama has definitely had a challenging year, a trying year. We are going to get to all of that in just a moment. But let's first think about how this is being framed. Let's just consider some of the competition here for a minute when it comes to the title of worst 5th year ever for a president. For instance, it was in the 5th year of his presidency, back in 1968, that Lyndon Johnson, who was besieged by war, by domestic unrest, by a complete collapse in his confidence of his leadership, that Lyndon Johnson practically lost the New Hampshire Democratic primary to a gadfly senator from Minnesota. It was Lyndon Johnson then, just months into his 5th year as president, who had to go on television and make this announcement.
I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
That was a bad 5th year for a president. As we consider all that's transpired during President Obama's 5th year, we could also think about the 5th year that George W. Bush had. Year 5 of the Bush presidency was the year of the Harriet Miers debacle, when members of President Bush's own party helped to derail his own shockingly unqualified nominee to the Supreme Court. This is not exactly the sort of news coverage you want to be hearing when you're in year 5 of your presidency.
Myers drops out as a Supreme Court nominee. Tonight, reaction to this stunning turn, what happened and what happens next. The votes weren't there in the U.S. Senate, and so tonight the Myers nomination has been withdrawn. The president will choose again, all the while knowing he may be just hours away now from untold political damage, from a grand jury looking into evidence that some in the White House were out to smear a man who questioned the underpinnings for war in Iraq.
Did you catch that at the end there? At the end of that segment with Brian Williams, year 5 of the Bush presidency wasn't only the year of the Harriet Myers debacle, it was also the year that George W. Bush's own vice president's top aide was indicted. The Scooter Libby scandal was blowing wide open during President Bush's 5th year. There's also a little something that year called Hurricane Katrina, which was not only a natural disaster of epic, tragic proportions, but also a disaster in leadership that President Bush never fully recovered from.
Today, the President of the United States visited this region, and while he was here, one of the major radio stations still broadcasting chose not to broadcast his remarks, saying at one point nothing he could say could ever help them deal with the dire situation unfolding live in the streets of New Orleans, where people were still dying during his visit.
Hurricane Katrina, Scooter Libby, the Iraq War, Harriet Myers. Now, that was a bad 5th year for a president. It was also in year 5, by the way, when something called the Saturday Night Massacre happened during the Nixon presidency. And in terms of devastating year 5 developments, this probably takes the all-time cake.
The Tonight Show will not be seen tonight, so that we may bring you the following NBC News special report.
Good evening. The country tonight is in the midst of what may be the most serious constitutional crisis in its history. The Attorney General has resigned. Elliot Richardson, who was appointed Attorney General only last May in the midst of the Watergate scandals, has quit, saying he cannot carry out Mr. Nixon's instructions. Richardson's deputy, William Ruckelshaus, has been fired. Ruckelshaus refused, in a moment of constitutional drama, to obey a presidential order to fire the special Watergate prosecutor. That's a stunning development, and nothing even remotely like it has happened in all of our history.
I know. That's not exactly a botched healthcare rollout there, but that was pretty bad. As was the moment during that same 5th year of his presidency when Richard Nixon had to go on national television and say this.
And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Year 5 of the Nixon presidency was the year when the Watergate scandal just blew wide open, when all of the dirty criminal details just came gushing out. That year was essentially the beginning of the end for Richard Milhouse Nixon. And oh, by the way, it was also during Nixon's 5th year that this happened.
Good evening. Spiro T. Agnew became a private citizen today, and less than 1 hour after his resignation as vice president became official, he was convicted of a criminal charge of tax evasion.
Having your vice president resign and then get criminally convicted on the same day, and having that only be like number 7 or number 8 on your list of problems as president, now that is the definition of a bad 5th year in office for a president. That's apparently not quite as bad as the 5th year that President Obama is having, at least according to a certain strain of conventional wisdom. Look, there is no doubt that this has been a disappointing year in a lot of ways for the president. He failed to get a background checks bill through Congress earlier this year. Immigration reform, it got through the Senate, but it's been stalled ever since in the House. There was the whole government shutdown, the botched rollout of the health care law. But it's also an open question as we approach the end of the year how the country is ultimately going to interpret all of this. Was this just a failure of President Obama? Was it a failure of Republican intransigence in Congress? Was it a failure of President Obama and Republicans? That's a question that has not yet been answered, and it may not be answered fully until the midterm elections, if even then. But right now, here is where things stand heading into the end of the year. President Obama's approval rating has now reached the lowest level of his presidency. The Republican Party, at the same time, is now as unpopular among all American people as it has ever been. That is the result of year 5. It hasn't gone good. It hasn't been good for anyone in Washington. What does that mean for what happens now? What happens ahead in year 6? Joining us now is Perry Bacon. He's a veteran political journalist and the political editor for NBC's thegrio.com. Perry, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thanks for joining us. So I really couldn't help but go back to the archives, and we have Spiro Agnew, and we have George W. Bush, and we have Lyndon Johnson, because, you know, I think it's important to see a little context here and say, you know, there's bad year 5s, and then there's what we're talking about here for President Obama. And I think maybe one place to start is, as you look at the year 5 for the Obama presidency, we highlighted some of the things that didn't happen. We can get into those in a second. There are also some things that did happen and that are in the process of happening this year that maybe aren't getting a lot of attention when we start talking about how bad it's been.
Let me name 3. You talked about 1. The president pushed for years to get taxes on the wealthy increased. He succeeded in January, the first time since '93 in which you had a real income tax increase on the rich. He pushed really hard to have the repeal of the Defense of Marriage Act. That happened. The Supreme Court did. He was very elated by that. You have this Iran agreement where he's talked for years about we wanted to negotiate directly with other countries. We want to eventually reach some kind of deal in which Iran stops building a nuclear weapons program. That may happen at the end of the year. The last thing is the president really wants to push through liberal judges. And by changing the rules of the Senate, something that was pretty controversial, he convinced the Senate Democrats to do that. And now he can appoint people, judges and executive branch folks as well, with just 51 votes. That is a change I think will make a big difference in the next 3 years.
So when you look at the Politico thing today saying, is this the worst 5th year ever? And we have to be honest, the poll numbers for the president right now are down. They haven't been this low for most of his presidency. What do you chalk that up to? What, is this residual frustration from the shutdown? Is this because of the website? What do you attribute that to when you see numbers like that?
I think there are 2 issues. There's one, the president talked about during this campaign, he used the phrase, the fever is going to break. He talked about how he thought the Republicans would start working with him and Washington would start working again. And you have to say the evidence is Americans are frustrated Washington is not doing stuff. Immigration reform blocked. Gun control legislation blocked. The government shutdown. These are not President Obama's fault. The Republicans are just acting the same way they were in 2011 and 2012, but Washington is definitely not moving. And you have to say the health care rollout was important because this president is one who was until now known for being competent. You may disagree with him, but you didn't think he was in. This is the one issue where it appears there was some just malfeasance and bad governing. The kinds of things that happened in the Bush years for the first time reared their heads here. And that you saw the polls directly drop during the health care rollout. And that's the biggest thing from the year where you say this is the one thing they could have avoided and they did not.
And yet here we are. Now we're moving from November, the month when everything went wrong with health care, into December when there are stories about some successes. There are stories about enrollment numbers increasing, the system actually starting to work a little bit now. So it seems like there's still an opportunity to turn that around. But let's talk about where this may be going, where the Obama presidency, where his relationship with Congress may be going as we look to the year 2014, because we have this budget agreement tonight. We have the Senate passing it. We have the House passing it last week. We also have, so wow, look at this. They came together. They passed a budget. We also had this sort of disturbing comment from Paul Ryan on the Sunday shows over the weekend where he took the issue of the debt ceiling and he basically said that's coming up in March and Republicans are not expecting to just approve another debt ceiling increase without getting something for it. That's that whole recipe for debt ceiling brinkmanship that's brought on so much crisis before. Is that a bluff, or do you think are we just going to be heading back to that kind of governance in the months ahead?
It's something in between. The Republicans are very wary of having another government shutdown style experience where their poll numbers shut down. And their view is the health care rollout has been so bad, this is their issue for 2014, and they don't want to muddy the message too much. So I think that was pretty much a bluff. They're going to push for some changes, but it's not going to be a 2011 style, the president has to agree to a huge amount of deficit reduction or else. They're not going to have that same gun to the head. They've learned the lesson. The strategists I talked to in the GOP say they are very wary of another situation where their poll numbers tumble. The president, at the end of the day, during some kind of impasse, always has the bully pulpit, and you can't lead. And John Boehner does not have that in the same way.
And that's why I'm so hesitant. I love talking about history. I love trying to put things into historical context on the spot. But I'm just imagining a world 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now when, let's say, the Affordable Care Act works. Let's say it's deemed a success. Then we will look back on year 5 of the Obama presidency and we will talk about how this hugely successful part of the social safety net in this country was created in year 5. We won't be talking about whether it was the worst ever. So it can be dangerous to make these historical assessments on the fly. But they're very interesting to talk about. And Perry Bacon, a political editor for NBC's thegrio.com, thanks so much for joining us and being a part of that tonight. While we are looking back, one of the most unforgettable political stories of 2013 has to be the biggest election anywhere in the country this year. It was the one in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and today it officially ended, and it ended in a way that makes it an even bigger deal. That is next.